Hello gamers, Power Heal here, and today we are going to be talking about the Resto Druid guide. So this is basically just going to be a general Resto Druid guide where we talk about the Druid, its strengths, kind of like how to play it, kind of like an updated version of what we did last time, right, before SOD came out, and then we're also going to go through each boss here, and we're going to break down kind of like how Druid works on them, what's effective, and stuff like that. So if you've watched the Priest guide, this is probably going to be somewhat similar in some respects, because we're going to, like, part of talking about how to do a boss is kind of like how to do a boss generally speaking, right? So we're going to be talking from the healer perspective, and primarily from the perspective of a Resto Druid, but, you know, it's going to kind of be revealed how to do the boss in general, most likely, as we go through some of these bosses, because that's, like, important to know to be able to maximize both your healing and your damage on these fights and stuff like that, right? And before we get into things, I just want to say you guys are amazing with, like, the support you've given on the last, like, couple videos, and like tons of people have been subscribing. I love all the comments. I'm gonna, like, react to. I've read all the comments, but I haven't, like, reacted to all of them yet. I've been really trying to grind, like, hard. I tend to really go hard at the start of these games because I like to just make a bunch of gold and then, you know, be able to kind of chill and then do, like, maybe some type of passive gold income, like, later on, right? But that way I can kind of do what I want in the later stages of the game. So I've been going pretty hard, but I'm going to sit down and, like, react to all of them and reply to the ones. I'm also going to probably make videos about some of them. For example, like, what's going to be coming down the pipeline is a Druid Priest video. And I was going to make this anyway, but one of the commenters actually commented specifically that him and his friend run Druid Priest, and that my Priest guide really helped them in terms of, you know, doing the raid the first time with the Druid and Priest healing, and they were looking forward to the Druid video, which I'm excited about, excited to make this about. It's always nice, like it's always nice to hear that your content actually helps, because, I mean, sometimes when I feel like if you're sitting here and you're just talking about the game and stuff like that, it can be, you can just kind of start to wonder, like, okay, like, am I saying is, like, super, am I saying things that are super obvious, you know what I mean, like, am I really helping people? So the fact that people, you know, seem to be, like, finding this stuff helpful, really makes me happy, and makes me want to keep doing it. So, I mean, I would keep doing it anyway, but so I'm really happy that you guys have enjoyed the content so far, and there's definitely more in the pipeline, but there's going to be a video specifically on Druid and Priest, because there's, like, really good synergy between those two classes, which is kind of nice, because it kind of operates independently of faction, right? So you can have Druid Priest on Horde, you can have Druid Priest on Alliance. It's not like, you know, you have, if I made a Paladin, if it was Paladin Priest that was good, or Shaman Druid or something like that, or Shaman Priest, then it would basically, you know, exclude almost like half the audience. So it's kind of nice that those two classes tend to pair really well together. And if you've noticed, if you're the type of person that checks into this sort of stuff, you'll see kind of like those two classes have been heavily featured in a lot of, like, the speedrunning and stuff like that. And I think that just in general, they're strong, like, on their own, even outside of a speedrunning scenario. But, like, you know, they definitely have really great synergy in a speedrunning scenario as well, so I'll kind of get into that, and I'll make a video covering that, both from kind of like a speedrunning perspective, and also just, like, you know, how they, if you're just a normal player, how those two classes can be really great at healing the instance together. Yeah, so that's coming down the pipeline, and then there's going to be some more videos as well, for sure I have ideas for. And another comment somebody mentioned was that, like, the last video was, like, 2 hours, and I know a lot of people like long-form content that have subscribed to this channel, but they also mentioned that, you know, it could be difficult to digest something like that, and I totally get that. As soon as this video is, like, being put up, I'm gonna go back through the other video and do the timestamps properly, so I think that should help with that. But also, I was thinking of potentially doing, like, more individualized videos for each boss if we wanted to do that. So, for example, like, I'm going to go through each boss here, kind of like the same style, because that's what we've been doing, right? But then you know, if we wanted boss-specific videos, I could do boss-specific videos, and that way, maybe if somebody wanted to reference a specific thing, they could just go to that boss video, you know, instead of coming back to one of these videos. But regardless, you'll have timestamps in this one, so, you know, it should be relatively easy either way. So, yeah, let's get into it, and I think I want to start with talents first. So I always like to kind of go back to talents because it's like a good place to start, and you know, we talked about talents in the previous video, but for this we're kind of like solidifying them, right? Is like, this is what is good. Now how what I've liked to be running is this, basically. That's not it. Already making a mistake. So it's basically like, this is the core, I would say, and then like people would probably say this is the core as well, and this is 25 points right here. Now what you can do is like, this is very flexible, okay, because meditation, while it's a good talent, and I would say like, you have to keep in mind that you're comparing everything relative to what else you can get in the tier, right? So, you know, 5 out of 5 Mark of the Wild is good here, but this is not really super impactful. The thing is, like, you don't really have anywhere else to put it. Even if you were like a PvP druid and like, you know, you didn't want to be changing specs, you could absolutely put points into Furor here, go like 5 out of 5, and just not have Mark of the Wild, because at this level in particular, it basically makes, in my opinion, virtually no difference, because the stats that Mark gives are just not super great. I don't even think we're at the point where it gives resistances yet. Right, so, you know, you could totally put points in Furor or something like that. I think the one that I really like having the 0.5 reduced cast time on Healing Touch, because if you're just like, this is where some debate will come in, right? Where if you're doing a hyper-specific thing, for example, if you're running with like a very static group all the time, and they're a really good group, they have really high DPS, you're basically speedrunning the instance, right? Stuff like this, just like kind of how we talked about it on the Priest, the reduced casting time and the normal heal, it becomes less important because you're actually not doing as much healing, and you're definitely not doing as much hard casting with people who are like playing well and are doing a ton of damage and just zugging the bosses down. And the trash is really easy as well, right? So you do tend not to need things like this as much. But if you're going to be playing with like pugs or just friends of varying skill levels and stuff like that, or you want to take your druid to GDKPs, I think it's always nice to have like a talent like this, because, and especially in the druid's case, the reason why it's particularly nice is because it's in the tree with the reflection here, or this is like the priest's equivalent of the meditation talent, right? So the problem with the priest, if you recall, is that if we go back in here really quick, right, we have to, if we want to get this, we have to sacrifice this, right? And you don't have to do that on Druid. So that's really nice, and it's just like another reason why I would take these talents. And I feel like if you're doing any situation where it's not completely optimized, then having access to a slightly faster healing touch can be the difference. Like a really good example would be Kelris, I'll talk about later, but basically sometimes you're going to have to hard cast healing touch on that fight if you're like the primary healer essentially. And you know, I'd much rather hard cast it with it being 2.5 seconds than 3, right? So you may see people do other things with these talents, and that's absolutely fine. If you look at Warcraft logs, some of the talents, even in like people who are doing healing, are more balance skewed, but you know, keep in mind that's probably for a very specific scenario. They're probably doing speedrunning type of stuff, etc. And with that being said, I do put the last 3 points in balance because we're going to be using Fury of the Storm Rage. Now, you could obviously do things a little bit differently. Like you could put 1 point there, 2 points here. You could not put any points at all in here. You can put a point in Insect Swarm and keep this up on the boss. I don't really know that like this is like super impactful in terms of reducing tank damage or anything like that, but you know, it can't hurt, right? And does a little bit of extra damage, so you can totally do that. It also lets you put the full 5 points into Improve Wrath, so doing something like this is not bad at all. The one thing that I don't really care for is kind of going deeper into balance, and the reason for that, I'm going to mute Discord noises here. That way you guys don't have to hear that. Yeah, so the the one thing that you got, or that I don't really like doing is going deeper into balance, because I feel like at this particular juncture in the game, there's not a ton that's like worth it to put points into, because Moonfire is just not a really good spell, and if you're healing, you're probably not really casting Moonfire because it costs a sizable amount of mana. Like, it's not like the most mana in the world, but it's definitely not cheap, and it doesn't do anywhere near like the damage of Sunfire, and it doesn't do the damage of Devouring Plague, or not Devouring Plague, sorry, a Void Plague from the Priest, so it's not really like very equivalent there. And I believe, if I just want to double check to make sure, yeah, see, Sunfire does not say anywhere that, oh, it does, okay. Oh, benefits from and triggers all effects associated. So I don't think that this actually benefits from the talent then. Because the wording on something like this, for example, like where is the other thing? Where is... Okay, so Star Surge says, Star Surge benefits from and triggers most talents and effects that have trigger or benefits for Wrath of Starfire. So in this particular case with Sunfire... all effects associated with Moonfire. So I don't think it benefits from improved Moonfire, but it may. You see what I'm saying? Like the wording there is a bit weird. But if it did, I mean, you could easily test that, and if it did, you could put more points into something like this, right? But the problem is if you, like, let's say we're trying to do like a full balance here. So we have this, right? You would probably put points into Reach, then you're at 21. And you kind of like have dead points here, so you'd put them maybe like, I don't know, anywhere basically, and then you only have 1 point into Vengeance anyway. But I mean, it is 20% crit multi, so it's not completely worthless. It's just that you don't have a ton of crit to begin with, right? And this is only increasing critical chance on Moonfire and potentially Sunfire, but that's only going to be the initial hit because the dot can't crit, right? So we're not really boosting our throughput as much as you might think, taking like 1 point into Vengeance. So it's up to you. I would say, like, if you're not in like a guild that's completely blasting, you just stick to the resto spec, right? With something like this, with the 3 points in here. And if you really wanted, you could drop points from there and put them in here, and just go like 1 meditation or 0 meditation, something here. But I would at least get this, and then you can get this, and I'd say that's kind of like the core of the build. And then for runes, so runes, Living Seed, the thing with Living Seed is that it's just, you don't crit enough at this point, right? And that's something we can revisit kind of when we maybe do get more crit, or if you're going to run the regrowth spec like way later on. But right now we can't even get to that talent, which exists here, by the way. If I get 50% crit in your growth, this can be kind of powerful in some cases. But right now we don't have access to that, and Living Seed is just kind of not so good, right? Because we don't have very much crit. The concept of Living Seed is kind of nice because, it's kind of like one of those things that's guaranteed to get value because it procs when something hits the target. So that's really good. It's just that in this particular situation, the uptime we're going to have on actual seeds is not going to be super great, right? And especially if we're casting something like Wild Growth, which I believe does not crit, it's going to be a large portion of our healing, so we're not really getting much Living Seed value there. So we take Fury of the Storm Rage for the first rune, basically, to help us do a little bit extra DPS while we have downtime. And the nice thing about this is because your Wrath costs 0 mana, you actually still regen during the Wrath cast. So that's like a very important thing to keep in mind. And that's a reason why like spamming Wrath is not bad at all on the Druid, essentially, even when you're healing. Because it's not incurring or affecting your regen in a negative way at all. So this is like the obvious one. You take Wild Growth here. It's just super powerful. And then you take a Star Surge here instead of Life Bloom. And the reason why, in my opinion, is Life Bloom is just, it costs a lot of mana. Now you get half of it back, but the problem is the spell's effectiveness is kind of like very contingent on you being absolutely sure you can get full value from the bloom, and it's typically very hard to get value from the bloom on anybody that's not the tank. And, you know, if you were maybe like purely tank healing, I could see potentially running this, right? Like if you were going to have pure dominion over the heals that go onto the tank. But a lot of times if you're running with something like Priest, which you probably will be if you're playing Druid, because typically groups like to take Priest, but they like to always use one Priest typically if you're like pugging at least. You know, if you're like doing speedrun or running with your friends who you know are good, you don't really have to use Priest, especially if you're consuming. But if you're in a pug and you want to kind of cover all bases and make sure your run goes smoothly, a lot of people like Priest because they can dispel the chains on the 6th boss. So the idea is that if people do not use a FAP to get rid of the potential to be chained, or if they don't use a shadow protection pot, you know, the Priest has some way to get the chains off of that person, right? And it's not just like taking for damage, because what happens is it'll hit one person, it'll spread, it'll, you know, do a bunch of damage there. So there's pretty much probably going to be a Priest in your run a lot of the time, and Priests are really good at healing the tank due to having penance. So it's kind of like, I know I said before, like before this expansion or this season rolled out, that Priests were not like a particularly good tank healer. I feel like that's kind of changed with penance, because it's just like such a strong ability in terms of just raw HPS value on the tank, as well as just mana efficiency, right? So if the Priest is going to be trying to heal the tank at all, Life Bloom definitely kind of conflicts with that, and I think that you're just not going to be able to consistently get that full value out of it. But if you can get the full value out of it, you know, I understand potentially taking that. Granted, the thing with Star Surge is that it's just so good, because this basically ends up costing like 6 mana or something, like 4 mana, or something crazy like that. And it does like 200 damage base on my Druid without basically any, or like 187, I think, maybe after like a little bit of boss resistance. So it's just like a crazy damage ability that you can cast almost like for free. And it's not completely free, because since it does have a mana cost, it does interrupt your regen. So it'll take you out of like the 5-second rule and stuff like that. I'm pretty sure that was done intentionally, because otherwise it would just be like insanely overpowered, right? But still, it's a very minimal mana cost, and in a lot of cases on the easier bosses especially, you'll be able to pump quite a few Star Surges into them if you so please. So that's basically like the rune setup that I would use. And just to kind of talk about something before we go into the actual boss by boss breakdown. So as you've noticed, I have 2 damage runes here. And I feel like in the history of Classic, doing damage as a healer has been somewhat of like a controversial thing. Kind of like the history of the game, to be honest, because I feel like retail really at some point decided that healers should be doing damage. Like while they're doing damage to heal, and that's like their healing mechanic, or in other parts, you know, they're doing healing or damage when they have downtime healing, right? And I feel like this kind of split the community back when, I forget exactly like around when this kind of like started to become like a real thing. It was like post, I think it definitely probably started in like Lich King and stuff like that. But I think what happened is like as gear kind of got better, and I think at some point spell damage was like homogenized with healing, right? So like when that happened, it's kind of a lot different, because now like your spells are maybe more worth casting because you have a bunch of damage on them that applies to both damage and healing, stuff like that, right? So basically at some point it became more efficient, like, or your DPS as a healer was kind of like more efficient. Not than like a regular DPS, but it was like more efficient than it was in like vanilla Classic, essentially, right? And because of that, on fights that were easy or in things you had already progged, you know, people would try and incorporate more damage to make the boss die faster, just to make the fight easier, or to help the parses of the group and stuff like that, or to parse as damage as a healer, right? For a lot of different reasons, just to kind of mess around, stuff like that. And then I think Blizzard kind of like saw that and like, ooh, we kind of like that, you know, maybe we can like facilitate that a bit more. And they kind of like built that into the game. So I know it's kind of going to be like a controversial thing. And I'll say at this point that I don't think that having your healers do DPS, like it's absolutely not required at all, right? Like if you are in a casual sort of guild and, you know, you're just playing with your friends and you don't really like the idea of like pressing DPS buttons and you want to take Life Bloom instead of Star Surge and stuff like that, it's absolutely fine for these sorts of raids. You know what I mean? Like, it's not going to make or break your raiding experience in BFD whatsoever. The content is very easy. You don't need the extra damage at all. Even if you just can't be bothered to do it and that's your reason, then it's absolutely not a requirement. I will say, I think that the trend they're going with this game, though, it seems like, is they do want that to be some sort of component going forward with the healing. I think that they're possibly afraid that what they don't want to do maybe is I think that they're afraid of having too strict like actual HPS in terms of raw HPS requirements, or that maybe they're too afraid of like making the fights like really hard to navigate mana efficiency wise, right? And they don't want people to get stuck on fights like that. So what they're kind of doing to add like another layer of skill expression to healer is they're giving you more buttons to press that aren't necessarily like healing centric, right? And I get that, because although in something like retail, I think I was very skeptical of them adding like the DPS component to healing at first, and the reason for that is because, you know, like at the time I wasn't even really playing healer, so I was playing DPS, so it didn't bother me in that sense. But it was, and I don't mind doing DPS. Like, I'm actually having fun pumping a bunch of DPS right now on Druid and Priest. But the thing is for me, it just introduces like another axis of balancing that they have to balance around. And in a game like SOD, I don't think it's anywhere near as bad, because I don't think the content is just going to be super hard, right? But the problem is like in a game like Retail, where the content progressively got more difficult, then that axis of balance, that additional axis of balance, it's just like another way that Blizzard can kind of mess up, if that makes sense, right? So it's like you could have a class that maybe does like really good healing, but now maybe they're not getting brought because they're, you know, they just don't do good damage, right? And this fight requires the healers to do damage or stuff like that. So it's just like I think that it can be an easy way for them to kind of get overwhelmed over there on the dev end of things. But I don't really see that being a huge issue in this version of Classic, because I think that they're going to just generally keep the content sort of easier, and what it's going to be is like, if you opt into doing more damage as a healer, you know, that's just going to be better for your raid. You're going to like clear faster and stuff like that, but the idea isn't going to be to like require your healers doing damage, if that makes sense. Right? I think that they're going to be able to strike that balance, because I think the way that you do that is you just don't tune the content very tightly, and it doesn't seem to have been tuned super tightly so thus far, aside from potentially, you know, Kelris with certain comp restrictions, but I don't think they're going to make that mistake again in the next tier. So that's just like a kind of like a forward about damage and healing. You're going to be hearing me talk about doing damage in here, and I'm just presenting it to you as an option, right? Like, if that's something you're not interested in doing, again, like, yeah, sure, it's the optimal way to play, right? But you don't need to do that for your raid to clear this instance. You know what I mean? So don't feel like I'm kind of preaching to you that you need to be doing this, even if I'm doing it myself, right? So just a little forward there. And yeah, so let's get into the actual boss by boss breakdown. Well, actually, I want to talk a little bit first about, we kind of went over the talents, went over the runes. I want to talk about like the general play style. And so basically, if you're going to be just healing, right? Like, let's say you're taking Life Bloom here, and you're not really interested in casting a bunch of Wraths or anything like that, then basically what things are going to look like for you is you're going to be casting like rank 1 healing touch, or not, sorry, rank 3 healing touch a bunch. When you can, you're going to cast rank 4, so like whatever it's completely mana efficient, e.g. like they can take the full amount of your healing touch, you're going to cast rank 4 healing touch. When it's not, you're going to be casting like rank 3 mostly, potentially rank 2. I have all 3 on my bar, but I primarily use rank 3 when I am using a healing touch, rank 3 or rank 4. Because like rank 3 will be used mainly to like spot heal, a little bit when people just take little bits of chip damage. Rank 2 is kind of like a spot heal as well, but that's only if like nothing was going on. And honestly, like I don't really use that rank anymore because I pretty much just use Fury of the Storm Rage and Star Sword. So if somebody's chunked that little, I won't get off the DPS to heal them because it's just not like a requirement to heal them at that point, right? They will get healed by probably miscellaneous wild growth ticks down the road, so I don't need to worry about tossing a really small healing touch on them, essentially. But yeah, like you'll basically be using those 3 abilities. Rejuve has some place in the raid for basically like when you can't be casting. So for example, on the Murloc Boss, it's not terrible. On the first boss, if people get knocked off, right, and you can't be consistently healing them, or if you're about to get knocked off, or if you have the debuff and you have to jump off, you can toss some Rejuves out. So situations like that, Rejuve is fine, but the thing with Rejuve is it absolutely does not even do like close to the mana efficiency of Healing Touch. So if you're casting Rejuve on a person, and you could have casted Healing Touch, basically, on that person and got the same effect, like, and you didn't need to, like, the advantage of using Rejuve in this particular level bracket is, like, you're saving time with the global, right? Because if the time is not important to you, then it's more mana efficient to just hard cast a Healing Touch on somebody. It does more healing per mana, right? So the only time you would cast a Rejuvenation is if, you wanted to be healing multiple people during that time period, right? Because obviously it only costs 1 global. So you can get more Rejuves out in the period that you cast a Healing Touch. But if you only need to bring one person up, you're pretty much better off doing it with Healing Touch than throwing a Rejuve on them. And also there's like a lesser chance that's getting sniped, right? Because it's a 2.5 second cast, which is kind of long, but Rejuve has like, what, a 12 second duration? Something like that. So odds are some of those ticks aren't going to make it through. So that's what you'd kind of be doing as pure healing, and then you'd be using wild growth like whenever your group takes, whatever group takes a significant amount of damage. And how I do the groups is I break the raid down into groups. I think that's like really important now on Priest and Druid when you're using these spells that affect like a specific group, like Circle of Healing or Wild Growth, because you need to be able to see the specific players together to judge obviously whether it's worth it to throw a Wild Growth in that group or not. So that's basically how you would play Druid if you're pure healing. And then if you're doing the damage Druid, which I would recommend, I guess, if you're like trying to get all the juice you can out of the class, then basically what you're doing is you're trying to heal sort of like as little as possible, if that makes sense. And I'll kind of go into that in more detail in the Priest Druid dynamic and how that kind of happens. If you have a priest, how that's like way more possible sometimes, but sometimes it's not going to be possible and you're going to have to basically main heal the run. Like I've done runs with my Druid where it was me and a mage healer that wasn't so hot at mage healing, and I was basically like doing all the healing, right? But ideally, if you're trying to do the damage Druid, is what you're doing is you're opening with Fairy Fire, right? Because you should always have strive for 100% uptime of Fairy Fire on the boss. I mean, like, sometimes there's going to be situations where it's going to resist, like, 5 times in a row because we have no hit right now. So, sometimes that's just the thing, right? And sometimes you're going to have to be, like, using all your globals right as it falls off so you don't get it back up right away. But, as long as you have, like, a relatively high uptime Fairy Fire, you're doing fine. And so you have that up, and then you're spamming Star Surge on cooldown because it only costs 6 mana, and then you're spamming Wrath into the boss, basically like non-stop. And yeah, that's kind of like how you play that version. And then the idea is that kind of like either by the time you get a proc from Fury of the Storm Rage, that somebody is a little bit low and you can just immediately use it on them, or if a lot of times, like, if I get a proc and nobody's, like, super low or something like that, or not super low, but nobody's chunked enough, I'll just hold it, because it doesn't, there's no point in, like, doing a bunch of overhealing on somebody, right, to heal them, like, a little bit, because the thing is, 12% proc rate, it sounds kind of decent, right, but it's actually not really that great, which means that if you just toss one of these instant heals away, you're not necessarily going to be able to get it back reliably for if you might need it like 10 seconds later or something like that, right? So I think that it's kind of better to be, a bit more conservative with the proc when you get it. And like obviously if there's somebody chunked out and you can basically top them off, that's good to do. But I wouldn't, be like looking to like, oh wow, I need to use this immediately so I can get to the next one. It's not really like that because it's not a damage proc, right? And ultimately, like there's only so much healing that can go out. It's not like on a boss where like you always want to be tending to use your procs at DPS because all damage goes into the boss, right? It's like all damage is effective damage, not all healing is effective healing, essentially. So that's kind of how I use Fury of the Storm Rage. And Star Surge you can basically use off cooldown. You have like a weak aura for it, or just have the cooldown in an easily accessible place. The one thing is it does interrupt your regen, so if like you are doing a fight where you're kind of struggling with that, you may want to be more cognizant of how you use Star Surge. But you can use Fury of the Storm Rage and Wrath just like ad nauseum. You can just throw them out there like a machine gun, essentially. You don't have to worry about that at all because that doesn't affect your regen whatsoever. So, yeah, you'd basically be... The idea with playing the damage druid is you want to be basically not having to do, like, the putback healing on the tank and stuff like that. And the only time you really want to be doing healing is when you have to drop, like, a big wild growth. So you're basically sitting there, you're DPSing, Star Surge, Wrath, and keeping your Fairy Fire up, and then, like, maybe on the Turtle Boss he explodes, right? And then you drop a wild growth on one group, keep DPSing, it comes off cooldown, drop a wild growth on the next group if they're still low, go back to DPSing. A bunch of people taking damage on the Murloc Boss, right? Drop a wild growth. Bunch of people taking reflect damage on Jett, drop a wild growth, etc. Then go back to DPSing, right? So that's pretty much like how you handle that. You kind of like, in order to be doing optimal damage, you don't want to be healing, because the more you have to hard cast Healing Touch, right, you just can't be casting Star Surge and Fury and Storm Fury, right? Like, if you have to be the one that's babysitting the tank, like, you're even going to miss Star Surge procs, you know what I mean, which is like instant, because you're just going to have instances where this comes back up when you're mid-cast or something. And since you're the one that's actually healing the tank, you can't cancel your cast necessarily. So I think Druid functions best in a scenario where you're kind of like not the primary healer for like the tank and stuff like that. And that's why it functions so well with Priest, because of Penance, essentially, right? Penance is like so good on that tank. The Druid doesn't really have to do anything until there's like a bit of AoE damage and stuff like that. So that's kind of like the general philosophy behind healing. You want to be doing like as much damage as possible with Wrath and Star Surge, and then you just drop that wild growth in there when kind of stuff hits the fan, or you need to heal multiple targets, etc. And obviously you can help out on individual targets as needed with wild growth and stuff like that. But we will go into fight by fight. So I drew this last time, but I'll just draw it again. So there's like all the little platforms, right? This, something like this. And then there's the beach. Right, and then there's the other beach. Oops, that is incorrect. The other beach, and then this is like the rock leading to the platform. I think there's a couple of them. And the boss is on like one of these, right? And so basically, like, you can either stand down here on the beach, and the boss gets brought to like the pillar over here, and the melee stand in a way where you can heal them, right? The melee DPS being, we'll call them orange. Right, they're on the platform though in this case, right? And then when somebody gets a debuff, they just jump off. I believe even if you, I think before in the Priest video I said that I don't know if the debuff affects people on the beach, but I think it does. So even if you get the debuff on the beach, I believe you have to run into the water right here and just drop it off in the water. So there's that. But pretty simple fight. If you get the debuff, you just go into the water and you heal them from the beach. You can also be on the platform here, but he will cast like lightning storms on you. It's not really a big deal. Depending on the range of your spells, like if you're trying to do the damage thing, and depending on where the boss is tanked, you may have to be on the platform. So just something to kind of like keep in mind. Being on the platform is not really bad in my opinion. I think it's just that sometimes it tends to get maybe a little crowded with the lightning storms, and it's mostly just that, like, if a knock does happen, it's kind of easier to heal people quicker when you have, like, your healers on the low ground already, and then the people are getting knocked into the low ground. So it's kind of like a safer type of strategy. But either strategy works, basically. And I would say on this fight, just if you're going to get knocked, like if you do get knocked, if somebody else, like, knocks you, or if you have to, like, you're going to have to jump off, you basically just want to use your instance to, do as much healing as possible before you get knocked off. And then you have, like, Rejuve and Wild Growth to basically pick people up either beforehand, or you cast them before you're getting knocked, and then the idea is they heal up as you're not able to heal them, right, because they still have the buff on them. So that's kind of like how I played as Druid. Like I said in the Priest video, you want to be staying ahead of the game here, because even though you have HOTS, it's just not ideal to be letting people sit at low life, right, when you have the potential to be knocked off the platform, even if it's not your fault, right? Somebody else can mess up, and you can still get knocked. So it's really good to just, like, stay ahead of the healing here. So if you need to, like, maybe not DPS as much to make sure people are healthy, that's absolutely fine. One of the things about the DPS is even if you are trying to do the DPS style, you never really want to forsake healing in the case, like, for doing DPS, if that makes sense. So, like, everything I said before about the theoretical interaction with the Priest and the Druid, that's all true and it's all good. But if you have a Priest that you're running with, for example, it's like a pug or something, and this guy doesn't really know what he's doing, maybe he's a new player or something like that, and you're finding yourself really having to carry the healing, the way you want to play that is to carry the healing. You don't want to be like, oh, well, you need to do your job, buddy, and then, because I'm just going to be doing damage, so you're the reason the group's wiping, like, you don't want the group to wipe. So, like to hold up the run, essentially, because you want to do a little bit of what is ultimately mostly insignificant damage on the Druid is not the way to go, right? So if you need to be that guy and, like, take over and hard cast the healing touches, don't be afraid to do that. But it's just that ideally, you're not really trying to do that. So that's kind of like how the first boss goes, right? And then let us... Can I just, like, refresh this somehow? New, right? Okay. So, next boss is, like, the turtle boss, right, where it's just a island, and then the turtle is in the middle. So, like I said in the Priest video, the explosion has, like, a radius, basically, right, and you can avoid the radius as a ranged DPS. So, I'm not sure if you avoid the damage, but you definitely avoid the knockback, if you're not, like, right up into him, which can be kind of relevant because the knockback tends to knock people into bubbles and stuff like that, or it has the potential to, right? So not, being in the knockback area tends to be pretty good. And just give me one moment, and then I'll get right into that. Had to get some tissues, nose a little bit runny. Okay, so basically, how you're going to do this fight is it's kind of like the fight that we just talked about, and this is going to be somewhat similar if you've watched the Priest video, where the idea here is you just want to stay ahead of the game, because when the turtle does his explosion, especially if you're running with, like, newer players who don't have a ton of HP, and especially if you don't have a Priest in your group or forward or something like that, it's going to do quite a bit of damage. I think normally it hits for around half, but if somebody is, like, really poorly geared, like no stamina gear or something like that, and you didn't really have, like, full buffs, like you weren't running a Priest, it could be, like, very problematic, and, it might actually take somebody to, like, 30% life from full or something like that if they were super squishy. So you want to have these people pretty much topped off, and, you can only do so much there because, somebody can take damage right before the explosion goes out, and if they do, then that's kind of like their fault, and there's nothing you can really do because you don't really have like a super instant putback cast. However, Wild Growth is like an instant. It's just all the healing it does isn't instant, obviously, right? It's over a duration, but the actual cast itself is instant. So one thing I will say is, like, definitely don't be afraid to drop Wild Growth beforehand, kind of like before the knock goes out, if people are chunked out already, right? Because you may be thinking like, oh, I want to save wild growth until after the explosion goes out, obviously, right? But it's really just better to make sure that they live no matter what. So even if, like, 2 people are chunked and, you know the wild growth is going to do a bunch of overhealing, right? But you don't really have the time to hard cast a healing touch on both of these people. You can just wild growth that group, basically, and, it'll probably give them enough HP during the duration before the shield's about to pop in order to survive the explosion, right? If the explosion is basically happening imminently. Whereas if you tried to, like, healing touch both of them, maybe you get one of them, maybe you get none of them, and they could both potentially die, right? And the thing is, like, after the bubble pops, there'll be some bubbles out for sure, but they start to dissipate. So, and he doesn't throw any more out, and until, like, he does the next round of them, right? So I think that typically the problem with the turtle in terms of people taking bubble damage comes from when the bubbles are being, like, thrown off the turtle onto the ground. Like, that's where they're apt to hit somebody. Once they're already on the ground, which they will be before the knockback happens, then it's not so much of a problem. And basically, like, they're either going to die by getting hit before and then getting hit by the explosion, right? Or they're going to, like, maybe be chunked out before, get hit by the explosion, then get knocked back into bubbles that already exist. And if that stuff happens, and it happens in too close proximity to the explosion, like I said, there's nothing you can really do. But once that does happen, if everybody survives that, nobody's really going to be taking damage unless they're straight up running into bubbles, kind of trolling you, right? So once the explosion happens, and the bubbles that are there, basically, that are still remaining are static, and they're going to dissipate pretty soon, then you can take as much time as you need to basically to get people up after that until the next transition. One thing that I think is that I didn't really mention in the Priest video that I probably should have is after the explosion, you really want to keep an eye on your tank, right? Because they just went to half health, and now the turtle is going back to auto-attacking and stuff like that, right? So everybody else can be, they're not on a timer to get back up, really. Like, technically they are, but they have a long timer. You have a long time to get people to full health before the next explosion, especially the Druid, because you're going to be running wild growth. And if you pop one wild growth on one group and one wild growth on the next, which you absolutely will have time to do before the next bubble comes out, the next bubble breaks, then you're going to be absolutely fine. So don't even worry about healing the people individually. Just drop a wild growth and then, like, make sure your tank is safe, and then drop the next wild growth, and you can probably go right back into doing damage, essentially. That's basically how I'd play this fight. I think that the other thing, too, is, like I said in the Priest video, is you want to be, like, kind of aggressive in terms of taking the bubbles. It helps to just take bubbles early on as a healer, so long as you know that, you're not going to be knocking anybody else, because they do a little bit of, like, an AoE around them when they go off. So as long as you're not going to be, like, messing somebody else up by taking a bubble near you, you're fine taking it, as long as you know you can heal yourself. It's a little bit more annoying on Druid, because you can't just, like, insta-cast Power Word Shield yourself and then get, like, the mana back for that and more, right? You have to kind of, like, walk onto one. Maybe you could throw a rejuve on yourself if you wanted. That's how you could play. You could actually pre-cast the rejuve, right? And then walk into the bubble, so you don't have to cast the rejuve after and waste mana after you've got the mana back and the rejuve's still on you. You could do something like that with wild growth. Like, you could actually just throw down a wild growth, like, beforehand, and then drop into a bubble, like on your group. So you can do all sorts of stuff like that, but you basically just want to be, like, if anybody is taking damage from bubbles or anything of that sort, you want to be on top of it, and you can be on top of it while staying at basically 100% mana, right? Because if people are taking damage, you just drop a wild growth in that group, and then, like, you drop a wild growth on your own group, and then walk into a couple bubbles. Now you're back to full mana. The wild growth is still ticking on you. You're at 100% health. and basically 100% mana, and they should be healed up from the wild growth as well, right? So don't be afraid to play aggressively like that, like I mentioned on the priest, with the bubbles early. And you want to be kind of going into that explosion phase having full mana, because that's the only part of the fight that's going to be like where you don't have any other help, right? Is like after that bubble breaks and there's no more, well, the little bubbles coming out that give you mana, you're basically having to get the groups back to full before the next explosion, and you're having to heal the tank until the next set of little bubbles come out that give mana, right? So that's the only time you can really go and you can have like tank healing problems. So as long as you go into that with close to full mana, you should be absolutely fine. Yeah, it's like a really really easy fight. Just like stay ahead of it, and know how the bubbles work, and take them early as needed, basically. So the next fight is the two. I'll go to the next thing here. So the next fight is the Naga, and it's like the princess one, I think, and then her big ad or something like that. You just kite the ad into the frost patch if it gets aggro on you. I've seen some people straight off tank the ad. If somebody does off tank the ad, it actually seems to do quite a bit of damage. I think definitely the intended mechanic is to run it through the frost trap, but it's definitely possible either way. The thing is, this boss has such little health that there's almost no time to go unless like catastrophic stuff happens with kind of everybody getting frozen. You can run through the frost patch to drag the ad in there, like I said, but you don't want to stay in the frost patch because it puts a stacking debuff on you that when it stacks to a certain amount, it'll just freeze you. So that's obviously really bad, especially as a healer. I believe priest can dispel you though, so if you're playing with a priest, I guess it's not that bad, but it's not something you want to happen, basically. This fight is basically, you're just going to be doing a lot of damage, because you're not going to need to heal very much in most cases, I feel like, especially if the ad is being brought into the frost trap like it's supposed to be. So you just kind of send it on the damage, and you'll probably be able to pretty much use the procs you get from Fury of the Storm Rage to kind of like carry the healing even with instant healing. And yeah, you're pretty much good on that fight. And going back to the turtle for 1 sec before we move on to the next boss, I just want to say that the turtle is a fight where if you DPS during the turtle, during the shell down phase in particular, that is like very helpful for the group because he takes extra magic damage, I believe. Right, so that's like one of your better fights as a druid with the ability to do damage, right? Spell damage. As a druid in my guild who crit the boss for I think like 800 and something with a Star Surge, so it can be kind of fun. I think I just normal hit him. I didn't get any crazy crits on my last run, but I normal hit him for like 600 something, I think. So yeah, it's kind of fun, and it definitely really helps speed up that fight for sure. Because especially a lot of people are running melee now, like melee heavy comps, so there's not like a ton of caster DPS, and generally you don't want them, but in that particular fight they tend to be kind of good due to that specific mechanic. So yeah, that's the third boss, and just a little bit about the turtle that I had neglected to mention. And then the fourth boss is the Murloc Boss. So this boss is basically, you can just pop a Shadow Protection Potion. If you think you're going to struggle with the dodging, it gives you like up to 1100, I think, if it high rolls protection. I think the Murlocs do around 400 shadow damage each, something like that. So just in the potion alone, you can pretty much get hit by 2 Murlocs and change, which is really good. So if you're struggling dodging, obviously, I always recommend people work on their fundamentals and get better at things like that, but the potion can be like a nice like safety net, right? Because having the potion on doesn't really inhibit your ability to dodge at all. So you can pre-pop the potion before the fight, and you try and dodge all the Murlocs, and if you do dodge them, then you basically have a free potion for a Kelris. That's like your motivation, And if you don't dodge them, then you at least you didn't die, I guess, right? Because you had the potion. And then you could pop another one during the fight if you really needed to. Sometimes this fight might get a bit hairy, and you may want to pop a mana potion during this fight, as long as you're confident handling the Murlocs yourself. It just depends on how well your raid is doing handling the Murlocs, right? The problem in this fight for Druid, I think, is that it's unlikely that everybody that's going to be taking damage is going to be taking damage in the same group, right, during the Murloc phase. Most likely, it's people that are going to be hit are going to be spread out between the two groups, which means that Wild Growth is going to be sometimes a necessary to cast spell here, but it's not going to be very mana efficient, right? You're going to be casting it to basically bring somebody back up. What I like to do is, if I can find a spot in between the Murlocs, I typically like to hard cast like a rank 2 healing touch, or sorry, a rank 4 healing touch here on those people that are low, because it's more mana efficient than dropping like an entire Wild Growth for one person, essentially. However, the Wild Growth is instant, right? So if there's a situation where there's a couple people in your group that are chunked out, you know, you really can't hard cast, you have to be on the move because there's Murlocs around you, you know, you definitely just throw down a Wild Growth there and hope for the best, basically. You can also complement it with Rejuve, if you really think that the person needs it as well. And that's how I'd kind of handle the Murloc phase of this fight. Otherwise, you're just kind of like doing damage during the other phase, and you can't really, I believe like he can still take damage during the Murloc phase, but it's just like super reduced, so you don't even really worry about doing damage during the Murloc phase at all. Yeah, I wouldn't worry about that one bit. Just focus on staying alive, you know, trying to keep people alive that you can, either with healing touch spot heals or Wild Growth in cases where it's applicable, where you can kind of like get multiple people up at once. I think it's worth dropping a Wild Growth even on a single person if you need to, like if you just can't hard cast a healing touch and you think that the extra healing might save them, because there are like thresholds for stuff like this, right? Average player is probably going to have around 1,000 health in this raid. The Murlocs do, like I said, around 400 damage. So, you know, if somebody gets hit by 2 Murlocs, if you had casted, like, a Wild Growth on them, then maybe they get enough HP to survive a final Murloc hit, essentially, right? So I think it's always worth assuming you have the mana. It's kind of something you have to judge in the moment, basically, because, you know, in certain scenarios, maybe everybody is just dry from having to heal people who've taken damage. Like maybe your raid just takes too much damage on that fight, and you don't have enough mana to heal the tank, kind of like towards the end of it. So in that case, you just kind of have to prioritize the tank and, you know, let some of those people die potentially, right, if you really don't have the mana. So it's just something you have to keep in mind, and you're not always going to be able to cast that Wild Growth on a single target to maybe help save them, right? It's kind of like a luxury you can do if your DPS is high, right? Or if you don't have to be tossing out a ton of other heals. But if you're already doing a bunch of other healing during the fight, then it's, you know, it may be rough to throw out that Wild Growth, and you may just be better off saving that mana for the tank. The other component of this fight is a curse. Now, when you dispel the curse, it fears the target. Basically, the trade-off is that, like, it's a 1 to 2 second fear, and the dot actually does like a bunch of shadow damage. It's like corruption or something like that from the Warlock, or agony. I think it's kind of like what it is. But the idea is basically that, like, if you can afford to eat the damage it does, then you're probably better off not dispelling it, right, and just healing through it, as your DPS get more uptime and it's less annoying for them because they don't get feared. The priest doesn't have to use a dispel to cleanse them, right? And in the end of the fight, he actually does a bunch of these agony dots. So if you're dispelling everything, you're basically just like kind of fearing your entire raid. But, I mean, it's kind of necessary if you can't keep up with the damage, right? Or if your group's damage is like really low and that last phase is going to last a little bit, because you may not have the mana to just last out all of the agonies essentially ticking on your raid. So it's just going to really depend on like how much damage your raid does and stuff like that, right? Whether you want to dispel that or not. And you typically, it doesn't really become a problem during the Murloc phase. I've never had one like overlap into the Murloc phase. I think if there is one active during the Murloc phase, I would not dispel it, because like unless your priest is like really on the ball with his dispel on the fear afterwards, somebody can like run into a Murloc and just die, right? Whereas at least the damage from the agony is predictable. So I would definitely advise against dispelling it in that situation, but otherwise it's just going to kind of be left up to your discretion, right? You're going to need to base that off of how strong you think your raid is, basically, and what the raid needs. And I'm going to just draw the encounter a little bit here, like I did in the priest. So it's basically the circle room, right? And then we're going to have the eggs. And like I said, if you're really struggling with this, there's a kind of like a thing here. I'll point that out in a second. Oops. Where this area is like the safe spot, right? Same as in the priest video. And the one thing about this safe spot is that it can kind of get overcrowded, because how the Murlocs come is they just like go in a straight line, I believe, from their egg, and they just intersect in the middle, right? So they all go to the middle, but they don't just go to the middle, they go through to the other side. So they're all going like through, right? From one egg to the other, which means that even though you're not dealing with these when you're in the safe spot, right? Because they start here and then going up. You're still dealing with these, right? Because they go all the way down. So it's not a completely safe spot, in my opinion. Even though you're not dealing with like the lateral ones, you're dealing with the ones on top. And that obviously there's shadow crashes that happen in that phase. So sometimes if a ton of people are here, the shadow crashes can kind of get baited, and you're dealing with the shadow crashes and the Murlocs. So it can get kind of like a clustery, basically, in that area. And it may be potentially worth, if that's something that you think might overwhelm you, just staying off to like another area. I'm going to reset this really quick. So like I would say if the room is like a circle, basically, right? And you put it into like 4 quadrants, this is like the kill zone in the middle, right? Because this is where all the Murlocs are kind of intersecting. But you have the safe zone, the pseudo-safe zone here, right, behind the eggs. And then you kind of have like these little pockets here, call them the blue zones, right? Where, you know, here the Murlocs from here and here are going to converge right away, right? But then it's going to be safe for kind of like the rest of the time, right? So there's like little pockets of safe zones. And also keep in mind that not every Murloc from every spawn launches at the same time. So you can kind of just play around these pockets. That's what I tend to do. I don't really play a safe zone. I just play around like the little blue circle pockets. So I'm not in the dead center having to, you know, do like bullet hell. But I'm also not in like a corner with everybody else, right, where everything is coming into me. And basically, if you get like a ton of those shadow crashes on your particular pocket, you just move to a different pocket, right? So if this pocket gets filled up with shadow crashes, I just move here, and then here, etc., right? And I think the shadow crashes kind of go away after a certain amount of time, so it should never be a case where the room is covered in them. So yeah, that's kind of like how you just deal with the general mechanic of the Murloc fight, essentially. And the next boss is Lorgus Jett, or whatever his name is. So on this fight, I feel like Druid can be very useful, because what tends to happen is, you know, when you start kiting the, it's obviously a gauntlet, right? And you have the little ad and the big ad. And the little ad, I think, is a healer. So a lot of people go on that first to try and kill it and kick it and stuff like that. So what I do as a Druid is I'm just like constantly pumping damage into the big ad. And the reason for that is because I know like my kicks and my normal damage dealers are working on killing the small one. So it's easier for me to just train the big guy, because he has to die eventually anyway, right? So, you know, I just toss up Fairy Fire on them and I go to work on the big guy with Wrath and Star Surges, and you'll basically end up killing him a little quicker if you do damage to him. And the longer he is up, the more damage your raid is going to take in the initial gauntlet part of the fight. So the quicker you dispatch of him, the better. And the idea is that if you do it quick enough, like I basically start phase 2 with like 100% mana, right? Not having to really heal the tank a bunch and stuff like that, right? And if the priest is with me, he's the other healer, he's pretty much at that point probably only having to put like penances into the tank. So as long as like that's happening, and then like your tank is rounding up the ads and the ads aren't jumping everywhere hitting everybody as the little Murlocs come out, it should be a pretty easy fight. I think that's like the main thing in this fight, is just the tanks want to be aware of getting ads. And in the earlier phases off the healers and stuff like that, and making sure that all the damage is like centralized on them, so it makes it like really easy for somebody to heal, especially like a priest or something like that, or even a druid with like max ranks healing touches. And yeah, so you just kind of blow up the big guy as your raids, killing the smaller guy and the big guy. And then when Lorgus comes out, I pretty much, I put Fairy Fire on him, I do a bunch of damage at the start, but then I immediately, like, as soon as he drops Wind Fury Totem, I pretty much just swap over to killing totems, essentially. I help out with those, because Star Surge is like an instant cast. So it kind of depends. If your raid has really good damage, maybe you only get to Star Surge the totem. And I have Star Surge on a mouse over macro, so it's just really easy. I just mouse over it, press the button. It does like a 200 damage nuke to it. It really helps. But the totems don't have that much HP, so if your raid is switching, and they're doing like a really good job of switching, that might be the only cast you get on it. And then you can kind of go back to Lorgus. Now the thing with Lorgus is, if he does have the lightning shield, so you have to be careful of that, and you have to be cognizant if you're DPSing as a healer of the totem mortar. So I believe the totem mortar is it's like magma, wind fury, and then lightning shield, and I'm not sure if it starts with magma or if it starts with wind fury, but regardless, the key thing to know is once wind fury is down, the next totem is going to be a lightning shield. So a way to safe strat this boss, basically, if you're having people like a really hard time in terms of people stopping damage, is the one thing is like basically once Wind Fury Totem goes down, I've seen groups do it where they make a rule where you attack Wind Fury Totem immediately as it goes down, you kill it, and then you don't go back on the boss until the next totem is dead, which is the Lightning Shield Totem. So that way it prevents people like basically accidentally hitting the boss. Now, like if you're a better player, you have stop attack macro, you might not need to do this, obviously, right? You can just hit escape at any point when the totem comes out. Also, I believe DBM and Bigwigs now have proper timers. So if you use add-ons, obviously, I think you actually can get a pretty precise timer to when the lightning shield's going to come out, which makes it super easy to stop damage on it, right? So you don't really have to do like that, like super safe strat, but if it's something that your group is really struggling with, you're better off doing that, because the way you're going to wipe on this fight is either lightning totem killing people, or your tank taking a ton of extra lightning shield damage, or Wind Fury procs killing your tank. But usually one of those two things won't kill the tank. So like the tank taking a little bit of lightning shield damage is normally fine. The Wind Fury totem being up is normally fine. But like when they're both happening together and the rest of your raid is taking damage, that's where things can kind of get a bit hectic. And if that's happening for you, like what you have to do is you have to prioritize keeping the tank up. Now, luckily on a druid, this is kind of easy, because what you end up doing is you drop your wild growth on the group that's most wounded, and then you immediately just start, healing the tank. But the thing is like if the Wind Fury totem isn't dying, then you really need to be constantly looking at the tank, because the moment you fall behind, it can be a bit fatal. Because the Wind Fury can actually allow the boss to do quite a bit of damage, especially on an undergeared tank. So you don't really want to get behind on that fight, on the tank specifically. You don't really want to get behind on anybody, because, if you're keeping the Magma Totem up, and I'll go into that in a second, but it can just hit somebody and do a bunch of damage to them. The Lightning Shield can come up and do a bunch of damage to them, etc. So it's a fight where you just want to, like, as soon as you notice a group of people is taking sizable amount of damage, you just drop Wild Growth, and then you immediately kind of go back to healing the tank. Now, in terms of the actual like strategy, I described one way you could do it, just a few seconds ago, but I would say there's primarily like 2 or 3 strategies, where like one is you kill every totem. That's like the simplest strategy by far, and it's probably the one you should be doing for the most part. But there's another strategy where you leave the fire totem up, because it's like the least dangerous basically, and you just DPS the boss during that, and then you kill the Wind Fury, and then you kill the lightning totem. And there's another strategy where you leave the fire totem up and the Wind Fury, and you DPS the boss during those, and then you only kill the lightning totem. Now, the problem with doing those methods in a group that's like not so geared, or doesn't do a lot of damage, or I would say maybe doesn't do, it's not that they don't do a lot of damage, but they do like mediocre damage, is that it's kind of strenuous to have the Wind Fury Totem up all the time. On the, like, basically if you don't end the fight, like, I don't want to say you need to end the fight really fast or anything like that, but if you take a long time to end the fight, and the tank has been sitting with the Wind Fury Totem, like pretty much having 100% uptime, they are just going to have to, the healers are just going to have to use more mana on the boss, right? And if you're the Druid soul healing this is going to be less damage you're getting out on other totems or the boss, right? So it has like negative consequences that kind of trickle down basically all the way. So I think that the easiest strategy, if you have moderate DPS, is just to kill all 3 totems, or at least kill Wind Fury and Lightning Shield Totem. The other problem with Wind Fury and Lightning Shield Totem, with Wind Fury and Magma Totem being up, is that I believe the ball just follows someone around randomly. So you can have this situation where, like, the boss just did a Wind Fury proc, right? So your priest just dumped penance into the tank, but now the ball is chasing the priest, right? So you're on the Druid and you're kind of doing fine, and then maybe like the tank is like takes a hit or something like that, but you're not like super concerned. Maybe you're still doing damage or something like that. But then the Lightning Shield Totem comes up, and then somebody messes up, or a bunch of people mess up, and then maybe the tank messes up. Now everybody's hit the Lightning Shield Totem, and some people are like chunked to basically half, depending on if they did like an auto and an ability or just an auto or something like that. The tank is chunked, and he still has the Wind Fury Totem up, right? And the priest is now running away from the ball, and his penance is down because he just dumped the penance in. It's about to come back up, but he doesn't have it yet, right? So you can run into these scenarios where the you're kind of like down your instant. I guess you still have shield on priest or something like that, but you're down your main instant on the tank from your other healer. You're not really super great at healing somebody really quick unless you happen to have a Fury of the Storm Rage proc, right? Which you might not at that particular time. So, and it's possible your priest even used his shield trying to save somebody else or something like that before that. So you can run into these situations where like everything kind of seems fine, but then all of a sudden like the perfect storm of events happen, and now you don't really have those cooldown abilities, and your tank is taking a lot of damage, and you have to hard cast that healing touch, and it may already be too late because the Wind Fury Totem's up, so at any time they can just take an extra hit and take a lot of damage, right? So that's why it pays to try and stay on top of the situation, and why, if you are going to be leaving totems up, you have to have, I would say, generally fairly good DPS, and you want to have people that are kind of like respecting the fight and playing properly, i.e. not taking lightning shield damage. I think the fight pretty much always comes down to lightning shield damage. Like, if you can do the fight in a lot of different ways as long as people aren't dying to the lightning shield, is how I would say it. You know what I mean? You can get away with a lot as long as that's not happening. Because, like, the Wind Fury Totem itself is not really a big deal, like I said, usually in itself, as long as people are not getting wrecked by the lightning totem. So just something to keep in mind there. And one final point in that fight is if your DPS is really, really bad, you may have to leave the Fire Totem and the Wind Fury Totem up and go boss. But this is a really bad scenario, right? Because it's like now the tank is taking extra damage. The lightning or the Fire Totem may be doing extra damage to the raid, and the fight's taking longer because you have bad DPS, right? So your healers may just here if your DPS is that bad, but it is possible to carry out situations like this. I did it on the Druid like one time. We had this like really low damage group, and basically they weren't, if they were killing the totems, they would only keep up with the totem damage. Like, so they basically had to not kill totems and only kill the lightning totem, and then kill the boss. And it was brutal, but we like barely did it. It's possible, but it's hard, and your healers are going to be like really strained in a situation like that. So if you are tanking in a situation like that, the best thing you can do is make sure you stop attack when the lightning shield totem comes out, switch targets to it, and then also when the Wind Fury is out, you can try and kite the boss away. You obviously don't want to kite out of LOS, so you have to be careful with that. But if you kite the boss away from the totem, it allows you to kind of still have the benefit of not having to DPS the totem, but the totem is now not affecting the boss, right? So maybe the boss gets like 1 Wind Fury hit in, right? Instead of like 2 or 3 or however many you get otherwise. So that's something you can do to help in groups where you're like really, really struggling, right? And I don't think there's like nature protection out yet, but if there was, you would use a nature pot. I think there is a potion that like temporarily boosts your resistances, but it takes your potion cooldown, so you're better off just, you know, using, I believe, like a health or a mana potion, depending on what class you are, right? So that is Lorgus Jett. I didn't really do any drawings for him because it's not really a drawing boss, I guess. And then Kelris. So Kelris is kind of interesting as a druid. Basically, you want to just... The main thing with this fight is you can get really bailed out by shadow protection potions. Now, as somebody mentioned in the comments of the last priest video, that you can also use a FAP in phase 2. I'm not really sure, like, what's better. The thing is that I think the reason why the FAP trend got started is because if you're, like, a top guild, what you can basically do is you can pretty much FAP as soon as he goes into phase 3, right? And or as soon as you see that maybe his chains in phase 3 comes off cooldown, because I'm not sure if it is like off cooldown right at the start of phase 3, because I don't think I've ever gotten chains like right at the start of phase 3. So you can maybe like wait a couple seconds into phase 2. Sorry, it's phase 2. There's only 2 phases to the boss. But so you could basically wait maybe a couple seconds and then pop FAP. And if you have really good DPS like a top guild does, you'll kill the boss in the FAP, right? So if you can kill the boss in the FAP, there's like pretty much absolutely no reason not to FAP, right? Because it actually prevents... FAP is a free action potion, by the way. It basically prevents the chains from even going on anybody. So if all 10 members of the raid FAP, he basically just cannot chains anybody. And if you kill the boss during that duration, then obviously that's a huge boon, right? But the other thing you can kind of do is you can... Obviously, you want everybody to shadow pot beforehand, and they can just re-shadow pot during the fight as well. And what that's going to help with is... it's going to have at least 800 damage mitigation. I think that's the low end of the shadow protection pot. So that should always eat the chains, the initial tick damage of the chains, right? And then it'll still eat a bit of the ticking damage of the chains as well, depending on how high your potion rolls. And it could still be available for like Mind Blast and stuff like that. And if everybody FAPs, the people who are getting hit by Mind Blast aren't going to be protected at all, right? Whereas like in a situation where everybody Greater Shadow Potions before the pull, and then they Greater Shadow Protection Potion, you know, during phase 2, you have a situation where they're basically being protected from all damage. So the only way it's possible for them to take damage is they'd have to take chains and then take a Mind Blast, right? And what you can even do in situations like this is you can dynamically use your potion. So for example, you know, you start pre-potted, right? And then maybe you guys are really good and you kick all the chains and Mind Blasts in phase 1, right? So you basically don't take any shadow damage at all. Let's say you're like a melee or something like that, right? And then instead of like what a lot of people would do is then the raid leader would call like, oh, shadow protection again, re-shadow pot. But if you know you haven't taken damage and you know your shadow pot is healthy, you don't re-shadow pot immediately in phase 2. You let either the chains come out, that's going to eat your shadow pot, right? Or maybe you're the Mind Blast target in phase 2 because it can't be kicked. That's going to eat into your shadow pot. And then once you notice you're actually taking damage, then you slam that shadow pot, right? And now, like, you've bought so much time for the healers, for the damage dealers, right? That's, like, the optimal way to do the fight, in my opinion. I think just having, like, 2 shadow pots. If your group is, like, not completely pumping. Like I said, I understand the reason why, you know, people use FAPs if the group is really good, because basically, like, the only thing that can do AoE damage on the fight is the chains, right? So if the boss is guaranteed to die within that 30 seconds of the FAP being popped, then it's very easy to just solo heal the Mind Blast, even if the person's initial shadow protection potion ran out from earlier in the fight, right? But you know, if the fight's going to go longer than that and it's going to be just generally chaotic, I tend to like having just people dynamically pop their shadow potions like as their first one fades, if that makes sense. So that's kind of like how I feel about the FAP versus shadow protection potion thing. It just kind of depends on, again, like the circumstances of the guild and stuff like that. So that's like how that works. If you need extra help there, use the shadow potions. But basically, how you're going to play the fight is your melee you're going to kick, and you always want to kick chains. But to be honest, in phase 1, I feel like Mind Blast can be almost more important to kick, because you have to kick it at some point, or the person has to get healed, basically, in a lot of cases. If the person is low health and there's no kick that goes through and there's no heal that goes through, the person will most likely die. So Mind Blast is the immediately more lethal spell, but Chains requires like a dispel, and it could go on multiple people if those people are close together, and he picks like a target that the other people are close to. So I think that's why people tend to like to kick Chains, because typically the range is told to stack. So if the melee misses a kick on Chains, the Chains goes out, it chains all the ranged, and even though in phase 1 the Chains doesn't do so much initial damage, it's just, you know, maybe 3 or 4 things the priest has to dispel, and they're wasting mana on that, you know what I mean? And then it still did some initial damage, so they're going to have to throw like a palm out or something like that. So yeah, basically, as a druid, you don't have to worry about any of this. Basically, like, your job is to basically just heal, right? Because you can't even dispel the chains if the melee missed the kick. So basically, you're relying on your melee kicking, and you're basically trying to do like a bunch of damage as the druid, I would say, in phase 1. You just want to like push the fight as fast as possible, because you want to have as much mana as you can going into phase 2. And the best way to do that is to give your melee less opportunities to mess up and not kick something by killing the boss faster, right? So typically how this fight starts for me is I'll Fairy Fire, just go into like Star Surge, Wrath spam, and then a lot of people will call for like a stack on the range, and you move to kind of like bait the little shadow crashes in sequence. I don't really like that so much. I tend to prefer, in a pug at least, that people are spread, because if I am unfamiliar with the person doing the kicking and I can't necessarily trust them, then I'd much rather like the range be spread out, and you know, maybe one person take chains if the cast does go off, then everybody being together and the whole entire range group take chains, especially if you don't have a priest. If you don't have a priest, I say spread out the entire fight, I'd recommend. But the arena is kind of like big, right? And there's these pillars, right? And then the boss is here. But there's like plenty of places to bait like the shadow crash. You know what I mean? You don't have to be on top of each other, really. At all. You can even kind of go over here and stuff like that. And the tank can like reposition the boss if needed. Like, you really can use this side of the room. Like, if you needed to. Like, typically the fight takes place in this quadrant of the room, I would say, right? But if for some reason like you had really bad crashes and this was all filled with like purple goo, right, you can just tank the boss. Like, you move him here, right? You can move him here, you can move him down here, right, and just play on the opposite side. Like, everybody just rotate over. That's easy to do for the most part, right? So people, I think, make way too much of a big deal about the amount of room that the swirlies take up in this fight, because in reality you have a lot of room to play with. I think you just have to move the boss before phase 2, because in phase 2 he can't be kicked. So while he's casting, he's going to be basically rooted to the ground. So it's either he's not going to move at all, or he's going to be moving very little, right? So just something to keep in mind there if you are going to try and move him. And yeah, basically there's a mechanic where somebody goes down and you're never going down as a healer. I don't want anybody to tell you to go down, because the person in there doesn't need a healer with them. And it's much easier to like if something goes bad upstairs, like, you don't want to be downstairs, because you want to be able to heal it as it's happening. It's like more efficient that way than for you to come back up and have, like, you know, half the group is at 50% life or something like that. Now, as a druid, that's not really that big a deal, because you just use wild growth. But as other healing classes, it's not so great. So basically, as a druid, you're just like pumping you're pumping with Wrath and Star Surge, and the idea is this is a fight where the instant cast on Fury of the Storm can really come in handy, because the Mind Blast does a lot of damage on this fight. So basically, like, you're fishing for that that instant healing touch proc, and then as soon as you see somebody take like heavy Mind Blast damage, just slam it into them. So I would basically hold the healing touch until you see that, and then just, you know, let it rip into them. And as a druid with the instant proc up, you can actually let the person take another tick of Mind Blast. So before you decide to use the healing touch or not, or you can like decide what rank you want. So how I'll typically do is I'll be just spamming Wrath. I'll have the proc, and then I'll see like a rogue or something. Let's say they take a tick of the Mind Blast, right? And then I'm thinking like, okay, like I wait to see if he takes another tick. And if he takes another tick, then I slam like a rank 4 healing touch into him, and that puts him to full basically, right? And it's instant. And because in my mind there, he might take the third tick if I don't heal him there, right? And then if he doesn't take the other tick because it got kicked, then I just like insta-cast a rank 2 on him, or something like that. Or a rank 3 healing touch. Just anything to like top him off, whatever he needs basically, based on what I think his percentage health is at relative to the value of my heal. So that's kind of like what I do there, and I feel like it's that's where the instant cast healing touches are really useful. The one thing is like, if you don't have an instant cast up, right, and you see somebody take a Mind Blast, how I play this fight, if you want to play it safe and you can't necessarily trust your other healer, is I immediately start casting a rank 4 healing touch on them, immediately. And this is where the 2.5 second healing touch thing comes in. Because the problem is that if you don't cast that healing touch, like immediately as soon as you see him take the first tick, if you start casting it when he takes the second tick, he will die. If he's going to die to 3 ticks. Not everybody will die to 3 ticks, but if he is like in range where he's vulnerable to dying to 3 ticks, then if you wait until he takes the full damage from the second Mind Blast, then he will die. Because how the Mind Blast works is it's basically like he picks a target and just keeps casting at them, right? So, you know, he does the first one, and you're like, okay, that's the target. And that's where you really have to like dial in. And even though it sucks and it's interrupting your DPS, I feel like that is the safe way to play it. If you don't know your other healer, etc., you don't know if you're going to get a kick come in to stop the next Mind Blast. Like, if you're trying to play super safe and not lose people, that is the way you kind of have to play it, because you just don't have an instant heal that can really turn the tide against the Mind Blast unless you have that instant healing touch up. Wild Growth might be able to turn the tide, but the thing is like, if you... the reason why I cast the healing touch, right, is because I can always cancel it, right? So if he takes a tick, I start casting max rank healing touch on him, and then he doesn't take another tick, I can cancel it and just cast a rank 2, right? Or a rank 3, whatever he needs. But, you know, I can't start it too late and then have it go through because he'll die before then. So you just have to be really cognizant, especially if you're like, if there's no priest in your raid, because typically what I like to have is the penance. The priest with penance is the one who heals the Mind Blasts, right, if they come through. Like, you pretty much save penance for those Mind Blasts coming through. And, but if you don't have somebody who can do that, then you really have to be proactive on the Druid, because if you're not proactive and you're too reactive and you wait too long, like, your heals are just too long cast, like I said, unless you have the insta-cast, right? So that's how I like to play Phase 1. And then Phase 2, basically, like, what you're looking for is at some point, he's probably going to change the melee. And hopefully the melee, they probably will be in a group, because they're probably with a Feral Druid for Wind Fury, or a Shaman for Wind Fury. So, basically, like, the change is going to come out on a whole group if people didn't have FAP or whatever. And if they don't have pods up, it's going to do like probably half their life or something like that. And at that point, you just immediately toss a Wild Growth on them. And then again, you're basically just now looking for the Mind Blast target. And in this phase, I feel like I tend to lean up on the damage being dealt. Like, maybe I'll still cast Star Surge, but in some cases, like, if I know there's a Mind Blast target, like, I'll just be cancel casting on them, right? If like, in other words, like, you know, if I know there's a Mind Blast target, I'm obviously casting on them, but then sometimes my priest will come through with Penance, but sometimes he'll still be on that target, and whatever target I can see him on with the Mind Blast, you can also use target or target, right, for this. Really good. You should always have the boss targeted. And basically, like, I'm just trying to keep that guy up, because the Mind Blast is, like, going to be the executor in Phase 2, essentially, for the most part. The change is going to be what gets people low, initially, potentially, but the Mind Blast is going to be, like, the executing damage. That's where a lot of the deaths are going to come in. And then, finally, with the tanks, this fight is not a fight where you really need true tanks, as I mentioned in the priest video. So if you have to let anybody die in this fight, ironically, you know, you usually never want to let the tank die, but this is a fight where, unless your tanks are able to swap to DPS spec or something like that, or DPS gear, they're probably not doing a bunch here. And the Mind Blast is going to hit any target, basically, pretty much equally hard, maybe unless it's, like, one of the new tanks that has, like, the specific damage mitigations or something like that, right? So, and it's not even guaranteed to go on a tank, but basically, like, a tank is you want to keep your hunter up doing a bunch of damage. You want to keep your DPS warrior up, right? You want to keep your rogue up. You don't really care about your 50 DPS tank staying alive on this particular fight. So if it comes down to it and you have to make those tough decisions to save mana or whatever, or if you just can't catch back up on somebody, kill the DPS first and you will kill the boss. Because this boss in the end is a DPS race once you hit Phase 2. And yeah, that is basically the fight. So we are on to the final boss, which is Akumai. We'll do this, right? And it's basically like room, like a kind of like a room like this, I guess, right? And there's a back to it. And you walk in this way, and the boss is like here. We'll say the main thing with this fight is, and this is pretty much for everybody, you want to play close to the boss, because if nobody gets hit by the breath of the boss, just play around the boss like this, right? And then you'd be looking for his cast bar, or just basically, even if you don't have cast bars enabled or something, which I do recommend, you should always have nameplates and cast bars enabled, but even if you didn't have those, you basically just always go behind the boss. So, like, the moment he turns, even if it's just to, like, hateful somebody or something like that, or if the tank spins him, like, you just go to the other side is the easiest way to play it. And if you're always on the other side of where he's facing, you'll never get hit by the breath. Right? It's just impossible. And the breath on this fight is not like a Nyxia breath. It's basically like this, right? Where it's like half her body goes across and out like that. It's like it's much more of like a cone from the boss himself, right? So you have a lot of leeway playing on the sides here, right? Whichever direction he's doing the breath, if this is the breath or if that's the breath, right? You can play on this side, this side, this side, this side. You don't have to be all the way behind him in a lot of cases, but obviously, you know, like, just so you don't risk it, it's better to play as behind him as you possibly can, right? And there's a couple things you can do here, especially as a druid. Like, you have battle res. Keep in mind, right? So like a strat you can do is you can let a tank get stacks, right? And instead of cleansing it and getting the adds, I believe you can just let the tank die and then battle res him. So you can do stuff like that. Paladin can, if you have a paladin tank, you can just bubble the stacks. You know, I think that even if you do a strat where you cleanse stacks, a lot of times you're better off killing adds, at least if it's late into the fight. So if you have to cleanse early, then yeah, maybe you kill the add early, right? Because maybe having the add up for the entire fight would be too much of a mana drain. But if you spawn like an add later on in the fight, like around like 50% or lower, you just go face. You just attack the boss basically, and you just off tank the adds, right? But yeah, this fight is like super easy as long as people don't get hit by the breath, and then like they're either taking ticking damage or they have to cleanse the ticking damage. If they cleanse the ticking damage, you get more adds, right? So that's basically like the long story short. Just play next to the boss, and it's really, really easy. This is another fight where having the instacast healing touch on deck can be really good, because as the tank gets more stacks, he starts taking more damage, and then in the shadow phase of the boss, the tank's max health actually gets decreased. So he takes higher damage in a relative sense, right? So having those big instant heals can really help keep the tank alive there. And then Wild Growth can be good in some situations because he does like a Hateful, and it can actually be really good if the Hateful sometimes, like if threat below the tank changes, it can be really good because you can have like maybe 3 or 4 melee DPS taking damage from time to time, and then like you can just toss a Wild Growth on them all at once and heal it, right? And it's healing the tank as well. So that can be like a nice ideal situation. But sometimes Wild Growth can have it can be hard to find uses for in this fight, because depending on how the damage is going out, like if people are doing a good job avoiding the breath, a lot of people aren't going to be taking that sort of ticking damage, right? That's going to kind of lower everybody all at once. So a lot of it is going to be tank healing. And I would say, like, basically you want to be focused on tank healing and just making sure your tanks don't die here. The people can deal with 1 stack, usually from the breath or something like that, pretty well, or like a couple stacks. So you can kind of afford to let people get low before you need to heal them. If you need to really prioritize a lot of your mana on the tank, obviously, right? It's just like if you keep the tanks up and you got reasonable DPS and not everybody is getting destroyed by the breath, this should be a really relatively easy fight, I would say. It's just not maybe perfectly suited for Druid. I mean, I guess if a ton of people are taking a lot of damage, it's good for Druid, but you know, then you might have a hard time doing the fight, right? Because Wild Growth, it's not cheap, even though it's really, really good, right? So, yeah, that's basically Akumai. And pretty much, I would say that sums up the guide. In terms of my overall thoughts on Druid, I think it's, like, really strong. I think Wild Growth is, like, way better than I thought it was going to be. It's just, like, it just has, like, more healing than I thought, right? And when something, I think it's just kind of, like, overstated healing-wise, which means that you don't have to be as, like, precise. And also the mana cost is not as bad as I thought either, which again means that, like, your uses of it, like, they don't have to be as precise, right? Like, you can get away with using it in what would be considered more suboptimal situations in terms of maybe the overall amount healing, or the overall amount it's going to heal, but it's doing maybe the healing quickly in a situation, so it's actually still useful in that situation, even if it's not doing its full AoE healing, right? So I think in that sense, it's just like a really good spell overall because of how it's tuned. You know what I mean? And where it still has those spots where even if it's not 100% efficient, it can still be really good. And it's still really good for throughput, which becomes more important kind of like later on as you get more gear, right? Like earlier on, when you don't have a lot of gear, you do kind of have to be careful when you don't have a lot of mana casting Wild Growth, and you do want to like push for it to cast more in situations where you are going to net closer to that 100% efficiency. But as you get more gear, you can kind of be a bit more liberal with that, right? And that's where it gets really strong because it does just do a lot of throughput. So when you get to the stage of the game where you're ending fights with like 30 to 40% mana, right? People aren't really going to be dying in those scenarios because you're just going to be able to throw Wild Growth out very aggressively, and you're going to have the damage on the boss to kill the boss quick enough, and so you don't go and you're going to have a big enough mana pool from having good gear, right? So yeah, that's basically how I would say that Druid pans out. Like, a lot of people are calling it strongest healer. If you look at World of Logs, there's a lot of Druids, I think, that have some like rank 1 parses, but healing parses are a complete meme. I still think priests are the best healer. Again, this is not about like, you know, memeing on like which class is better than which class. Like, I don't really care. I play all the classes, right? It's not like a favoritism thing right that. It's just, I think that objectively priest is just stronger because it's more flexible, right? Like, priest could absolutely do the HPS Druids are doing in these logs. It's just that they're probably not taking Circle of Healing because Penance is so good. It's such a clutch ability, right? Priest has the Dispel. Prayer Mending is insane. A lot of priests, I know they're not using Prayer Mending right now. They're using Homunculi. I'm going to go into that. I'll make a video on that. It's definitely really good to do that, depending on your raid comp. But the idea is that you can always still use Prayer Mending if you need it, right? Whereas, like, Druid is pretty much they're always showing their hand, right? Whatever a Resto Druid is coming to your raid with, that's pretty much what he's always going to bring. Whereas like a priest, if you do need more healing, the priest can give you more healing. Essentially, there's like an extra gear they can kind of go into. And like I said, they're just overall more versatile. The shield is insane. Penance is insane. Palm is insane. The homunculi debuffing is insane. The damage per global and an ability like Void Plague is really good, right? So all these things, in my opinion, I do think Priest is overall like the better healer, but I think that Druid's still exceptionally strong. You can still absolutely main heal on a Druid, right? So and I think that the reason why, like I said, I'm going to make a video going into the synergy, but to sum it up kind of quickly, a TLDR of it is that the priest is like really good at being, if you have a priest and a druid in a comp, the priest is going to sort of function as like the primary healer, right? Where they'll throw up Void Plague and they'll wand, and then when the tank is like dipping, they can literally let the tank dip and then just dump a penance into them. The tank goes to like full health, essentially, right? And when you have a group that's doing really high damage and you have players that are, good at the game and they're not getting hit by stuff they don't need to get hit by, and they're doing the mechanics properly so they're not taking damage, what that allows the druid to do is he is literally just training the boss the entire time with Wrath and Star Surge, right? And if anything bad happens, if stuff hits the fan, he drops the Wild Growth, but otherwise the priest is like taking care of that single target healing, and the priest is actually still able to do pretty good damage because the priest damage is from a dot, right? Like a super mana efficient dot. And then the wand, he can still be wanding because Penance can catch him back up on that tank in a way that Druid can't really do without being really mana inefficient, right? So that's why they're so synergistic. And the Druid also compensates for the priest's weakness when the priest takes Homunculi and they take to shred the armor and do the debuffing, and then the priest takes Penance. The one thing that they're sort of lacking is the AoE healing, right? Because they don't have Circle of Healing because they took Penance, and they don't have Palm, so that's not bouncing to do AoE healing. So that's where the Wild Growth like really comes in and carries, right? Because if there is ever a circumstance we need to get that AoE healing down, the Wild Growth covers it, and the Priest is covering the tank healing. So it's basically like the Druid is doing the clutch AoE healing when he's needed, and otherwise he's just allowed to blast. And then the Priest is doing the clutch tank healing with the Penance, and is otherwise allowed to blast, and it's just like a really, really good synergetic combo. So I'll make a video kind of going into more detail about stuff like that, but I just wanted to mention it because it is kind of relevant to Druid healing, right? So it should be in the Druid video as well. Yeah, so thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, thank you all for like the support recently and all the comments and stuff like that. I read them all, the good and the I read the suggestions, the critique, everything like that, so feel free to leave any sort of comments, and I will take a look at it and hopefully reply to it. So thank you guys again. Like, comment, subscribe if you liked it. If you didn't like it, obviously I'd never expect you to do that, but thank you guys again, and I will talk to you soon.